Hello and welcome to the Musicking Podcast. I'm your host Trinity Lei, and this is part 2 of our 3-part series on the Jola Ekonting. We talked about the history and background of the Ekonting in the previous episode, and now we'll take a look at how to perform, understand, and appreciate some of the nuances of Ekonting music. I thought that would be a good idea to sort of introduce our audience, because this is the first episode that we're doing over music in the African continent. So some conventions of African music and some ways to think about African music. I was wondering, is there a word for music in the Jola language?
You know, that's a good question. There are kind of words for song and for, different dance styles, but no, not really for music in that way. People a lot of times now will just use the French word musique to talk about music.
In a lot of African languages, there's not a word for music because it's such a just natural part of life that everybody participates in and doesn't think too much about, that it's just, kind of a useless word or useless abstraction. In Jola culture, everybody's expected to participate in music.
Yeah. So, as I said, there's not traditionally a kind of a social role carved out for music makers in the way that you do see in some neighboring West African cultures. So, that said, like there are people within communities that people know, oh, this person is really good Bahan player or a really good Ekonting player. So they do kind of become known for those things. But yeah, I mean, it's something that everyone takes responsibility for. There are many reasons why music is an important thing to do in social life. So everyone has to take responsibility for doing that. So, either participating via, singing as part of collective choruses, or dancing is certainly a big part of musical participation. Yeah. Or, whether it's playing instruments that are specifically built for that purpose, or sometimes using like a bottle and a spoon, for example, to kind of tap out a rhythmic figure. That happens a lot when you're playing Ekonting in these like small, informal social gatherings where the Ekonting is the only like quote unquote musical instrument, but maybe there's something around that can be used to complement it. And yeah, people take responsibility for doing that.
What's the way that musicians in the Jola culture describe music?
Right. I mean, so for example, like we were talking about that story. So the idea of something being sume, that's like good or sweet. Yeah. So there's kind of little terms like that, but in general, there's not a lot of, as you said, abstracted language about music. People don't talk about rhythm or meter or things like that, for example. But they do give names to certain figures, like Ekonting, for example, like I said, is a kind of a specific dance and a mellow rhythmic figure that's played on drums, but you can also incorporate it into the Ekonting.
The word mellow rhythm, it's the idea that melody and rhythm aren't separate. They're interconnected. So a melody line serves as a rhythmic drive, and then the rhythmic drive is also the melody line. So some other conventions are the cyclical nature of the pieces. Does that apply to Jola music?
Yeah, definitely. I love that term mellow rhythm too, which comes from an African writer named Meki Nzewe. And I think it's really, to me, a real key to understanding this. So part of the idea of mellow rhythm is that instruments that we think of as primarily percussive, like drums, they often do actually have a kind of a pitch content. And that's true in the case of the Ekonting rhythm. I'm just going to go with that. Has the sort of two-toned. So if you do that, like any Jola, especially from like Western Cosmons, I'd immediately know that's Ekonting. And so you can put that under the Ekonting. And people do that. They kind of take those mellow rhythms that are played on percussive instruments and then put them into the Ekonting. And that song too, I was just playing Korye. It feels like you're just sort of playing this repeating figure, where a lot of the kind of excitement of that is the groove that comes out of repeating it in that cyclical way. Mm-hmm. But then when I start singing, you realize that is also actually the melody of the song. So yeah, they're really not separable in that context. This is an Ekonting that was made by a guy named Fidel Sambu, who's a really great Ekonting builder. I said most people build their own instruments, which is true, but then there are a few people who are kind of known for building really great instruments. And I love this one. You can't see it, of course, but it's that the gourd is really big. It's maybe 2 feet long, even maybe longer than that. And it has a nice long neck and everything. So I think it has this really full voice. So thanks, Fidel. So I don't know, what should I play, Trinity? Just anything. I'll play this song that a lot of people play, and a couple of people have told me it's one of the really old Ekonting songs. And the lyrics to it in this case are about a woman getting on a bus and going to Dakar, basically. And then maybe she'll get married there. So those are the lyrics. So it's interesting. It is kind of in that context of courtship, but actually in this case about, potentially losing out on a romantic partner because they're leaving the Casamance and going to urban Dakar. The kind of tune itself is supposedly really quite old. I'll start playing and it almost just sounds like this kind of ostinato figure. But then when I start singing, you'll hear that actually the vocal melody is kind of what the Ekonting part is based on. So they are kind of mirroring each other. Koriembe junakarum, suni nanimabo, koriembe junakarum, suni nanimabo, koriembe junakarum. Suni nanimabo, koriembe junakarum, suni nanimabo. Koriembe junakarum, koriembe junakarum, suni nanimabo, koriembe junakarum, koriembe junakarum, suni nanimabo.
Okay, so what are like the basics of performance when it comes to the Ekonting? What notes do you play? What's like the technique?
Sure. Let me see how well I can describe this in words as I'm holding this instrument here. So the Ekonting has 3 strings, and these days they're made out of nylon fishing line, pretty similar to guitar strings. In the past, people used palm roots that they wove together. So you have these 3 strings, and each of them is a different length, which is a somewhat unusual feature that you see on a lot of West African stringed instruments. So there's the short string, the middle string, and then the long string. That gives you 3 notes. And then in addition to that, on the longest string, you can stop the string using your fingers at 2 points. And so that gives you an additional 2 notes. So... And those are the only 5 notes you play. So you don't go into a different octave range ever. It is like it's literally a pentatonic instrument, which is an interesting part of it. I mean, there's no reason that you couldn't do that because the neck is, fretless. So there's an infinite number of notes that you could potentially play. But people really stick pretty closely to those. I've only rarely heard anyone kind of add in passing an extra note here and there, which again, there's no reason you can't do. But I think part of that limitation is what makes it exciting to listen to and challenging to play for me because you're limited to those 5 notes. But sometimes the vocal melody will go into different octave registers, and you kind of have to play with that.
The vocal aspect of it is such an important part of playing the Ekonting. Like, is there just solo Ekonting ever? Or?
No, not really. It's always kind of used to accompany song. And yeah, there are a few different styles. There's the kind of melodic style where what you're playing on the Ekonting, the melodic line of the Ekonting and the voice basically match up. And they sometimes depart slightly in kind of light heterophony. So that's one style. Another style is really based on these like repeating ostinatos that you just keep going and you keep going throughout that. And that's a lot of times used in more kind of storytelling songs where there might be part of the song that's sung, but then actually people will kind of move into a declamatory speech mode and just start telling a story over this repeating ostinato. Mm-hmm. There's maybe a third style is just being a little bit more melodic and it has less of a kind of a rhythmic groove to it. But even that, always there's someone singing to accompany it too. So
with the singing, since there's only 5 notes possible on the Ekonting, is the singing just reserved for those 5 notes? Yeah, so this is an interesting thing about the Ekonting that I like a lot. So the scale of the singing is always going to be pentatonic for Ekonting music. There are other genres of Jola music that
use hexatonic scales. But even though you have those same 5 notes, you might, as I said, continue singing like up into a higher octave register. And when that happens, there's just this effect that I find really cool where the voice is going to keep going up, but then the Ekonting has to jump down to catch those same tunes, those same notes. It happens in a lot of songs, but I'll play this one, which is actually kind of nice because it sort of describes the context of an Ekonting performance. So this is a song that was made by a guy named Paul Agoyo Jeju. And I learned this song in the first summer that I spent in Gambia. I learned this from my first teacher, Musa Jata. And then many, many years later, I actually met Agoyo, the guy who made it. And it was this really exciting moment for me because I had known about him for a long time. The lyrics are saying, "The time has come to rest. Somebody go get Mustafa Sambu, and maybe he'll bring his Ekonting and play." So it's kind of like, the end of the day. But it sort of feels to me like there's kind of 2 parts to the melody. And in the second part, there's a great example where the voice keeps going up, but then the Ekonting jumps down to catch the same note. Watu eri peka ulo George Chenle Mustafa Sambu mantinya pula Ekonting ajata agoyo ajata chakungwenot. Watu eri peka ulo George Chenle Mustafa Sambu mantinya pula Ekonting ajata agoyo ajata ajata agoyo ajata chakungwenor. So you hear that ajata. So the voice keeps going up, but then it goes up, I guess, a second, and then the Ekonting jumps down a seventh. So you're playing the same note, but the kind of melodic arc looks a lot different. So I always enjoy that as this interesting kind of textural feel of the music.
Is there any chords that you play?
Yeah, only very rarely. People say note by note is the way of playing. And you can hear they're pretty kind of short staccato notes is often what you kind of want. And I think the fact that the soundboard is skin rather than wood facilitates that too. It like cuts out a lot of the sustained notes, so they die really quickly, as people say. You really almost never will play 2 strings at the same time. The times when I have heard people do that, it's usually when they are playing in a style that is influenced by another kind of music, especially kind of international popular musics. One of my later teachers, Adama Sambu, loves reggae, as many people do in the Cosmos. And so he'll sometimes have this kind of offbeat chord feel in his playing where he'll be plucking 2 strings at once that's inspired by reggae. But in more traditional style, you almost never hear that.
And I really enjoyed reading about how the Ekonting playing and the vocal line interact, like how certain musicians go about accompanying the vocal line and taking into account how dense the syllables of maybe a certain line is. They'll maybe drop out the more rhythmic aspects of the Ekonting, and then when they're just holding a note, they'll start adding in some rhythmic figures to create this undulating interest. You have to be very good at knowing the song and being able to react to the vocal line in order to be a skilled Ekonting player. Yeah,
no, I think so. I'm really interested in that too. I mean, I find it hard, actually, like what I was just describing, where the contour of the vocal line often feels different than the contour of the Ekonting line, even though they're ostensibly playing the same notes. But like the really good Ekonting players that I've talked to that just seem to have no trouble with that at all and can just extemporaneously play songs like that, which I think is really a mark of their skill and entrainment in being able to do that. But yeah, just in more generally, the kind of interaction between the voice and the Ekonting, I think is really interesting too. I've had some people tell me that, the Ekonting always follows the voice and kind of you start with a vocal melody and then the Ekonting kind of fills in around that. But then I also know that some people have told me that when they create a song, they start with the Ekonting part and then the vocals kind of come later. So it really is this kind of like dialogic interaction between the instrument's voice, which comes out of the way it's built and the way it's played and everything. And then the human voice too. So yeah, it's a really rich area of interaction. And like you were saying, the way people kind of might massage a vocal line by adding in a few extra notes on the Ekonting to kind of keep the sort of the pulse moving. Or in some cases, they might just sort of depart slightly, even in the kind of note order. Yeah, those are really interesting and exciting moments in songs.
And we mentioned briefly how Ekonting players like to keep things more simple, but is there any sort of ornamentation that people add to the Ekonting accompaniment, or is there any sort of improvisation?
One of the things that banjo players are very interested in is like drone notes, because that's a big part of banjo playing. The fifth string on a banjo is this big drone string. It's just the same note. And so, part of people who are curious about the Ekonting, they always want to know, is there a drone string? And there isn't really a drone string, not in the same way that a banjo has one. There are strings that are played open, but they're played open at places when that's where the melody goes. So it's not just kind of playing an accompanying drone. But then in some cases, like as an ornament, people will use those open strings to create just a kind of an extra rhythmic feel. And so arguably those could be thought of as a kind of a limited drone role. So that's part of the ornamentation. There are also these kind of like physical actions that you might do where just because of the way that the action is, you can really quickly alternate between two strings by plucking one with your thumb and then striking downward. So things like, and where it's like just a very quick transition from one to the other that comes out of the playing style. And so you'll hear people doing that to kind of ornament a melody. Yeah, I would say kind of in traditional context that I've heard, there's pretty limited improvisation. It tends to really be, based around this one melodic line that the Ekonting and voice share, and that's just kind of repeated. But then there are also players who kind of starting in the early 90s started developing Ekonting music for more presentational contexts. And some of those players, people like Adama Sambu and Ablai Jallo and Buba Jeju, Paul Agoyo Jeju, Jean Kangaben, these players have done things with the Ekonting that I haven't heard so much in kind of more traditional village settings. And those guys do more kind of ornamentation on the Ekonting, even taking like Ekonting solos, for example, which might be improvised. Adama Sambu does that a lot. And he very frequently will kind of bring in like a rhythm that's played on a drum and start that as the basis for an improvisation in an Ekonting solo. And he's just an incredible player. His like hand speed and dexterity and clarity and ability to manipulate the timbre of the instrument is like unreal.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode, which is part 2 of a 3-part series on the Ekonting. We've covered the past and the present, so to say, of the Ekonting, and now in the next episode we're going to look at the future, how new songs are composed, how songs are distributed, the recording industry, some changes that are being made to the instrument, and how certain artists are adapting the Ekonting to new contexts, and some new projects that are coming out in the future to be excited about. So we hope to see you in the next episode. Please follow us on social media at MusicKingPod and go to our website, www.musickingpod.com. Again, hope to see you in the next episode.